1,656 years. Write that number down in your mind, and do not let go of it, because it is the most important number in this story. And by the time you understand everything hiding inside it, you will never read the first pages of your Bible the same way again. 1,656 years. That, by the oldest Hebrew reckoning, is the exact age of the first world. Not roughly, not approximately, exactly. From the morning Adam opened his eyes in a garden that no longer exists, to the day the rain began and did not stop, the world that came before ours lasted 1,656 years, and then it drowned. And here is the part almost no one has ever told you. That number was not an accident. It was not a surprise. Buried inside the pages everyone skips, inside the long chains of names and ages that read like a phone book, the ancient text has hidden a countdown, a clock assembled out of birthdays and lifespans and deaths, ticking down generation by generation toward a date that was fixed before most of the people in this story were even born. Every birth in the old world was a tick of that clock. Every death moved the hand closer to midnight, and near the very center of the countdown, a prophet would hold his newborn son in his arms and give the child a name, one single word, and hidden inside that word, according to a reading that has haunted scholars for 2,000 years, was the deadline of the entire human race. The oldest man who ever lived was not a marvel. He was a message. He was the clock made flesh, and when his heart finally stopped, the sky broke open. That name, what it may mean, and the almost unbearable precision of when its owner died, is waiting for you deeper in this story, and I promise you it is worth the journey. But you cannot feel the weight of the ending until you have lived through the age that led to it. So this is the complete history of the world before Noah. All of it. Every generation from the first man to the last morning, the garden and the gate, the first murder and the 28 years of grief that followed it, the first city, built by a man who was cursed never to settle, the first song ever recorded in human history, and the shock of what it celebrates, the first idols, the flood before the flood, the warning almost nobody remembers, when heaven rehearsed the ending centuries in advance, and mankind watched the waters rise and learned nothing, the king who never died, the old man who outlived his own son, the ark rising plank by plank in dry country while an entire civilization laughed, and at the end of it all, 7 strange silent days, when the ark stood finished, the animals stood loaded, the door stood open, and heaven, for one final week, did absolutely nothing. When you learn why those 7 days existed and who they were for, it will close this story like a key turning in a lock. One more thing before we begin, and then the clock starts. Hold on to a date for me. The second month, the 17th day. Do not ask why yet. Just keep it somewhere you will not lose it, because this history is going to return to that exact date at the very end. And when it does, you will feel the entire 16 centuries of this story close into a perfect and terrifying circle. The second month, the 17th day. Remember it. Now, where does a complete history of a vanished world even come from? It comes from the pages you were taught to skip. Open the Book of Genesis and you will find in its 5th chapter one of the most avoided passages in all of Scripture, the long genealogy of the generations of Adam. And this man lived so many years, and begat a son, and lived so many years after, and all his days were so many years, and he died, and he died, and he died, 10 times over. And Genesis is not our only witness. The Book of Jubilees, the ancient text the early church called the Little Genesis, a book old enough that fragments of it slept in the caves of Qumran beside the Dead Sea Scrolls, retells this same history with an obsession for dates that borders on the forensic, fixing events to the exact year, sometimes to the exact month and day, in a calendar counted out in weeks of years and jubilees of 49. And beside it stands the Book of Jasher, the lost book that Scripture itself names twice, whose surviving text fills the silences of Genesis with names and cities and speeches and crimes. 3 ancient witnesses, 1 timeline. Where they agree, we will walk confidently. Where they differ, or where a tradition stands alone, I will tell you plainly, because this channel deals in what the texts actually say. And what they say, taken together, is a story far stranger, far more detailed, and far more devastating than the 2 or 3 verses you half remember. So let us go back, all the way back, year 1 of the world. The text of Jubilees begins where Genesis begins, with the 6 days, but it watches them like a witness rather than a poet, counting as it goes. On the first day, the heavens and the earth and the waters and the abysses, and darkness and light, and Jubilees adds, all the spirits which serve before God, the angels of the presence, the angels of sanctification, the angels of the winds and the clouds and the frost and the thunder, the entire invisible civil service of the universe, created in a single day, and standing ready before the world had a shape. On the third day, the dry land, and on it already the garden. Eden was not an afterthought, planted once man existed. In this telling, the garden came before its gardener, prepared like a room made ready for a guest who has not yet arrived. And on the 6th day, the guest, Adam, formed, the old texts say, from the dust of the ground, and made alive by the breath of God himself, the only creature in all creation that heaven made by hand. And then Jubilees does something Genesis does not do. It starts the calendar. Adam, it says, was brought into the Garden of Eden after 40 days had passed from his creation, and his wife after 80 days. And for this reason, the text explains, the ancient laws of purification after childbirth count 40 days for a boy and 80 for a girl, because the entry into Eden was the pattern, the first homecoming, replayed in miniature at every birth for thousands of years afterward. Whatever you make of that claim, notice what it tells you about how this book thinks. Nothing is a loose thread. Every custom has a root, and every root has a date. And the date-keeping continues, because Jubilees then tells us precisely how long the Golden Age lasted. Adam and his wife, it says, were in the Garden of Eden for 7 years, tilling and keeping it. 7 years. Sit with that for a moment, because almost no one carries this detail in their head. The paradise of Eden, the era every human heart has been homesick for ever since. The age painters and poets have spent 3,000 years trying to imagine their way back into, lasted, by this ancient count, about as long as it takes a child to go from birth to their first day of school. 7 years of mornings without fear, 7 years of work without sweat, of a world without a single grave in it. 7 years when the animals, Jubilee says, still spoke with a common tongue, and the man and the woman walked with their Maker in the cool of the day, and the word death was a word about trees. And at the close of those 7 years, the visitor came, and here the little Genesis records the detail I asked you to hold, the one this entire story will circle back to at its end. At the close of the 7 years, which he had completed there, the text says, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, the serpent came and approached the woman. There it is, the 2nd month, the 17th day, the exact calendar date by this ancient reckoning, on which everything went wrong. The day the question was asked, hath God said, the day the fruit was taken, and the eyes were opened, and the first fear in the history of the world sent the first humans scrambling into the trees to hide from the sound of their own Maker walking. You know this part of the story. The serpent's cunning, the woman's reach, the man's silence, the fig leaves, the voice in the garden asking a question God already knew the answer to. Where art thou? What you may never have noticed is that the oldest traditions stamped a date on it, the way a coroner stamps a date on a certificate, and then filed that date away for later. The 2nd month, the 17th day. The wound of the world has an anniversary. Keep holding it. The sentence fell the same day. The serpent, cursed above all creatures, condemned to the dust. The woman, sorrow multiplied. The man, the ground itself, cursed beneath his feet. Thorns and thistles and sweat, and at the end of the long road, the sentence that would define the next 16 centuries. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Death entered the world as a legal verdict before it ever arrived as an event. And that gap, the strange delay between the sentencing and the first actual death, is going to matter enormously in this story, because for the better part of a century, humanity lived under a death sentence while never once seeing anyone die. Think about the psychology of that. A world that knows death is coming and has no idea what death looks like. Then the exile. God, the text says, made for the man and his wife coats of skins and clothed them. The first recorded death of any creature in the world was heaven itself, killing an animal to cover human shame. And then he drove them out, eastward, and placed at the gate of the garden cherubim, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Hold that image, because the old world lived its entire history inside of it. The garden was not destroyed, the garden was locked, somewhere to the west of every settlement in this story. Over some horizon, the first home of the human race still stood, green and watered and empty, guarded by beings of fire, and every generation you are about to meet grew up knowing it was there, and knowing they could never, ever go back. The first world was a world with a lit window it could see, and a door it could not open. Jubilees adds one final detail to the exile that lands like a soft blow. On the day Adam left the garden, it says, he burned an offering of incense at the gate, frankincense and galbanum and myrrh, a fragrance rising at the door that had just closed behind him. The first act of worship in the fallen world was performed on the wrong side of a locked gate by a man saying goodbye. And then the mouths of the animals were closed. On that day, the text says, the beasts stopped speaking, each kind sealed into its own voice, and the world went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. And Adam and Eve walked east, into the silence, into the land the text calls Elda, the land of their creation, to begin the world we know. The clock was running now, year 7, more or less, of 1656. Children came. Genesis names 3 sons of Adam and gives daughters no names, but the old traditions are more generous with the arithmetic. Jubilees counts the births in its calendar of weeks, and by its reckoning Cain was born when the world was in its 60s, and Abel a few years behind him, and after them, daughters. The first generation of children ever raised by the only 2 people in history who could remember paradise, in a world where no one had ever yet died. Imagine being their parents. Every skill had to be invented. Every rule had to be written on the spot. There were no grandparents, no neighbors, no older village wisdom, nothing but 2 exiles, their memories of a better country, and the growing sons in front of them. Cain grew into a tiller of the ground, a man of the cursed soil, wrestling thorns for bread. Abel grew into a keeper of sheep, a man of flocks and open country. 2 brothers, 2 vocations, and, the text says, in the process of time, 2 offerings. Cain brought of the fruit of the ground, Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. The text does not fully explain the difference, and honesty requires saying so, though ancient readers notice that Abel brought his first and best while Cain brought merely something, and the letter to the Hebrews would later say Abel offered in faith. But whatever the reason, watch what happens next, because the next few verses contain the first psychological portrait in all of literature, and it is a portrait of a man deciding to do the worst thing that had ever been done. Cain was very wroth, the text says, and his countenance fell. His face fell. You have seen that face. Everyone has seen that face. And then God himself intervenes and speaks to Cain, and what he says is the first warning label in human history. Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Stop on that sentence, because something enormous just happened in it. That is the first time the word sin appears in the Bible. Not in Eden, not at the fruit, here at the door of a jealous man's heart, and it appears not as an abstraction, but as a creature, crouching. The Hebrew word paints something animal, coiled at the threshold like a predator at a den's mouth, desiring him. And heaven's message to the first murderer, before he was a murderer, was simply this: it is at your door, it wants you, and you can still rule over it. Cain was warned, by God, personally, face to face in words. In the very next verse is the field. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. The Book of Jasher, filling the silence, says the quarrel flared over land and flocks and the division of the world, and that Cain struck his brother with the iron of his plow. a farmer's tool, the instrument of bread, turned into the first weapon in a field, out of sight, by a man who had been personally warned by the voice of God days or hours before, and the first human being ever to die was not the old man Adam, full of years. It was the young one, the innocent one. In the first world's very first funeral, the parents buried the child, and they did so having no word for what had happened, because nothing had ever happened. Jubilees fixes the year of the murder near the end of the world's first century, when Abel was a young man in his 20s or 30s, and then it records a detail that will break your heart if you let it. Adam and his wife, it says, mourned for Abel 4 weeks of years. 4 weeks of years. In the calendar of Jubilees, a week is 7 years. The first parents grieved their murdered son for 28 years. 28 years of a house with a missing chair. And only when the mourning ended, the text says, in the 130th year of the world, did Eve bear another son, and call his name Seth. For God, she said, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Even the name of the replacement child carried the wound. Genesis marks the same year, Adam 130, and adds a line that ancient readers treasured. Adam begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. In his own likeness, the image of God passed through the fracture of the fall into the line that would one day carry Noah. The clock reads 130. 1,526 years remain. But we cannot follow Seth yet, because the murderer is still on the stage, and his story is one of the strangest in all of ancient literature. Cain confronted, lies to the face of God. I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer comes back with the sound of the earth itself opening a case file. What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. The ground testifies. The soil that received the blood becomes the first witness for the prosecution, and its testimony convicts. And now art thou cursed from the earth, God says. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. For a farmer, it was the perfect sentence. The man of the soil is divorced from the soil. The earth that drank his brother's blood will starve him. And Cain, hearing it, speaks the first recorded despair. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and it shall come to pass, that every one that findeth me shall slay me. Notice what Cain fears, not the wandering, the finding. In a world that is one single extended family, every future human being is a relative of the boy he killed. And Cain understands, with terrible clarity, that he has just invented something that can be done back to him. And here the story turns in a direction nobody expects, because heaven's response to the first murderer is not execution, it is protection. Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. The mark of Cain. No one knows what it was. The text never says, and I will not pretend it does. A sign, a seal, something visible enough to warn and strange enough to be recognized on sight by people not yet born. The first murderer walked away from the first trial carrying a divine restraining order for his own safety, and he went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And even the geography is a sentence, because Nod, in Hebrew, is simply the word for wandering. Cain went to live in the land of restlessness. He would be there a very long time. Hold on to him, because his death, when it finally comes, centuries from now, is one of the most astonishing stories the old books preserve. And I will take you there before this part of the history is done. Now watch what the cursed line builds, because it will unsettle you. Cain knew his wife, one of the daughters of Adam, the only mothers available in a world one family wide. And she bare Enoch, not the Enoch, another Enoch. The name was common. And then comes one of the most quietly shocking verses in Genesis. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. The man sentenced to wander built the first city in the history of the world. Read that again. The first city was not raised by the faithful line as a temple town. It was raised by the first murderer as a wall against his own curse. Condemned to restlessness, Cain answered heaven with architecture. If the ground will not hold me, I will hold the ground. Stone against sentence. And civilization, in this telling, is born not as mankind's triumph, but as a fugitive's defiance, a fortress built by a man who could not bear to keep moving. Everything urban, every wall and street and tower that would ever rise, traces its lineage in this story to a marked man trying to outbuild the judgment of God, and his descendants inherited the talent. The text sprints down the Cainite line, Enoch to Irad to Mejuel to Methuselah to Lamech. And at Lamech, the seventh from Adam on the dark side of the family, the story stops and stares, because Lamech is a collection of terrible firsts. Lamech took unto him 2 wives, the first polygamist, the first man to treat the pattern of Eden as negotiable, and the names of his wives and children are recorded because his household became the engine room of the entire ancient world. His son Jabal was the father of such as dwell in tents and have cattle, the inventor of nomadic herding, the first rancher. His brother Jubal was the father of all such as handle the harp and the pipe, music. Melody itself, the first instrument, the first tune ever hummed in the darkness of the ancient world, invented in the House of Lamech, in the line of Cain. And the third son, Tubal Cain, was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, metallurgy, the forge, the furnace hot enough to make stone weep metal, and the hammer and the edge. And if you walked with us through the Book of Enoch, you will feel a strange echo here, because that book names a fallen watcher, Azazel, as the being who taught mankind the working of metals and the making of swords. And Genesis names a man, Tubal Cain, as the first master of the forge. And perhaps the 2 traditions are simply looking at the same terrible classroom from 2 different doors, one recording the student, the other accusing the teacher. Either way, notice what the first world now contains, all from one family: the city, the herd, the harp, the blade. Civilization arrived as a package deal, and the package was assembled in the house of a killer's great-great-great-grandgrandson. And then Lamech opens his mouth and human literature begins. This is not an exaggeration. The oldest piece of recorded poetry in the Bible, arguably the first poem in the memory of the world, is the speech Lamech makes to his 2 wives. And once you hear what it actually says, you will never forget it. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 70 and 7-fold. The first poem is a murder boast. The first verse ever composed celebrates a killing and demands escalation. Cain, the ancestor, killed once and was ashamed and begged for protection and received a 7-fold guarantee. Lamech, 5 generations of cities and forges later, kills and sings about it and rounds heaven's mercy up to 77, as if divine restraint were a family heirloom he could inflate at will. In 5 generations, the line of Cain went from a murderer who feared vengeance to a murderer who wrote it music. That is the moral trajectory of the first civilization, measured in its own art. But who did Lamech kill? Genesis does not say. It leaves the young man in the poem nameless, a shadow. And it is here that the Book of Jasher steps forward with one of the most extraordinary stories in all the lost books. A story that closes the circle of Cain with an almost unbearable irony, and I will tell it to you the way the old text tells it, flagged honestly as Jasher's tradition, because Genesis is silent and this book is not. Lamech, Jasher says, grew old and his eyes were dim, so that he could no longer see, and when he went out to hunt, he was led through the fields by his young son Tubal Cain, the boy of the forge, who would watch the countryside and aim his blind father's bow for him. And one day in the distance, Tubal Cain saw a shape moving in the brush, a shape with something rising from it like a horn, and he took it for a beast, and he told his father where to aim, and Lamech drew, and the arrow flew, and the shape fell. And when they came near to see what they had taken, they found an old man face down in the field, with the arrow in him, and upon him the mark. It was Cain, the first murderer who had wandered the earth for centuries under heaven's protection, outliving his own legend, was killed by accident, by an arrow loosed from the bow of his own blind descendant, aimed by a child of his own line. in a field, the same stage where it all began. The man who killed his brother in a field died in a field, by his family's hand, mistaken for an animal. And Jasher's story is not finished, because when Lamech understood what he had done, that he had slain the ancestor whom God himself had marked untouchable, he clapped his hands together in horror and grief, and struck the boy beside him, his own son Tubal-Cain, and the blow killed him. 2 deaths in one afternoon, the beginning and the end of the cursed line story folded into a single accident. And now read Lamech's poem again with Jasher's story in your ears. I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. The man, Cain. The young man, his own son. The first poem in human history was not a boast at all in this telling. It was a howl. A blind old man explaining to his terrified wives that the 2 bodies were an accident, and hiding behind Cain's old guarantee, if Cain was avenged 7-fold, surely Lamech, who never meant it, 70 and 7-fold. The tradition and the plain reading of Genesis stand side by side, one a war song, one a lament, and the manuscripts leave you to choose. Either way, the arc is complete. The line of Cain begins with a body in a field and ends its recorded story with 2 more, and the ground, as always, keeps drinking. Meanwhile, in the other family, the quieter one, the clock kept ticking. Seth, born in the year 130, grew, and in the year 235 of the world he fathered a son and called him Enoch, a name that simply means man, mortal man, frail man, as if the 3rd generation already understood something about itself that the first had to learn the hard way. And in the days of Enoch, Genesis records a single, ambiguous, fiercely debated line. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Read one way, it is the birth of public worship, the first congregations, the first prayers of a gathered mankind. But there is a second, darker, ancient reading, preserved in the old Jewish traditions, which renders the same Hebrew as then men began to profane. Then calling by the name of the Lord was polluted, and understands the days of Enoch as the moment mankind first bent the knee to things that were not God, the first idols. Jasher takes that darker road without hesitation. In those days, it says, the sons of men began to trespass against God, and they made themselves molten images, and every man his god, images of brass and iron, wood and stone, and they bowed to the work of their own hands, and the whole earth was corrupted. Barely 2 centuries out of Eden, within the living memory of a man who had walked in it, because understand, Adam was still alive. Adam watched this happen. The species that had heard the actual voice of God in a garden was carving substitutes out of firewood, and heaven answered. And this is the part of the first world's history that almost nobody on earth remembers, and it may be the most important thing you hear in this entire chapter, because it means the flood of Noah was not the first flood, it was the second. Jasher records that in the days of Enoch, because of the idols and the corruption, the anger of God rose, and the river Gihon, one of the 4 rivers of Eden itself, overflowed its world, and the waters rose and seized and drowned, the text says, 1/3 part of the earth. 1/3 of the world underwater as a warning. Heaven staged a rehearsal of the ending, 16 generations early, using Eden's own river as the instrument, as if to say, this is the mechanism, this is what I will do, turn back. And the sons of men, Jasher says, did not turn back. They saw 1/3 of their world drowned for the idols in their hands, and they kept the idols, and when the waters withdrew, they rebuilt on the mud and carried on. And the seasons in those days, the text adds, began to be confused, the sowing and the reaping faltering under a low-grade curse, the whole machinery of the world grinding slightly out of tune, and still nobody turned. Remember this when we reach the ark and the laughing crowds, and you find yourself wondering how an entire civilization could watch a man build a ship for decades and never once take the hint. They had already seen the water. Their great-grandparents had waded out of the first warning and gone straight back to the workbench to carve new gods. The old world was not ignorant of what heaven could do with water. The old world had simply decided it did not care. The generations turned. Enosh fathered Kenan in the year 325. Kenan fathered Mahalalel in 395. Mahalalel fathered Jared in 460. And the name Jared, as those of you who walked through the Book of Enoch with us already know, is itself a date stamp and a scar, because Jared comes from the Hebrew root that means descent, to come down, and the Book of Jubilees says plainly that he was called Jared because in his days the angels of the Lord descended to the earth. The Watchers, the 200, the oath on the summit of Mount Hermon, the forbidden teachings, the daughters of men, the giants, that entire catastrophe, the single greatest wound the first world suffered before its final one, detonated in the days of this one quiet name in the genealogy, somewhere in the 5th century of the world, and we have told that complete story, every chapter of it, from the oath to the origin of demons, in its own full documentary on this channel, and if you have not heard it, it is waiting for you when this history ends. For now, mark what it did to the clock. From the days of Jared onward, the countdown of the first world is no longer merely a story of human drift. There are other actors on the earth now. Forbidden knowledge is loose. Something not entirely human is being born in the settlements. The corruption that began with a fallen face in a field and grew through cities and forges and idols has now been joined and accelerated and armed from above. The clock is at roughly 500, 11.5 centuries remain, and the old world's night is about to produce its single brightest light, because in the year 622 of the world, in the darkest generation yet, to Jared, the man whose name meant the sky came down, a son was born, and they called his name Enoch, the 7th from Adam, the one the whole ancient world would remember, a boy born into the age of the Watchers, who would grow up to do the one thing no human being had ever done, and who would leave the earth in a way no human being ever has since. His story, the crown of the first world, the walking man, the scribe, the king that the lost books say ruled the whole race of men for 243 years and was taken from them in a whirlwind of horses and fire, is where this history goes next. And it is in his story that the countdown finally shows its face, because Enoch, the man who walked with God, will hold a newborn son in his arms, and heaven will give him the name to speak over the child, one word, and sealed inside that word, by the reading that has chilled readers for 20 centuries, is the appointment the whole first world is keeping. The name is a sentence, the sentence has a date, and the date is coming. The boy grew up in the worst century the world had ever seen. Understand what the earth looked like in the years of Enoch's youth? The Watchers had descended in his grandfather's generation. The forbidden arts were loose in the settlements. The forges of the Cainite cities were burning day and night. The idols of Enosh's era stood in every household, and in the villages of men, women were giving birth to things that grew too large and ate too much. This was the world that raised the 7th from Adam, and the old texts say he responded to it in the simplest way imaginable. He withdrew. The Book of Jasher records that Enoch, as a young man, hid his soul from the corruption around him, and served God in secret, and walked apart, alone with the presence that had once walked with his ancestors, in a garden he had never seen. And for 65 years, that is the whole story. A quiet man in a loud world, keeping himself clean, bothering no one. If the history of the first world had ended there, you would never have heard his name. And then, in the year 687 of the world, Enoch's wife bore him a son, and everything changed. Listen closely to the order of events in the 5th chapter of Genesis, because the text is telling you something with its sequence that it never spells out in words. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years. After. The walking began after the boy. For 65 years Enoch had been a righteous man among many. From the day his son was born, he became something no human being had ever been, a man in continuous daily walking communion with God himself. And he stayed that way for the next 3 centuries. Something happened at that birth. Something arrived with that child that took a devout man and turned him into the walking man. And the ancient answer, the answer that has raised the hair on readers' arms for 2,000 years, is hiding in plain sight in the one thing about the child the text actually records: his name. Methuselah, you know the name. Everyone knows the name. It has become a joke, a byword, a crossword answer. The oldest Methuselah of 1,000 birthday cards, the oldest man who ever lived, 969 years, the world record that will never be broken. What almost nobody knows is what the name may actually say. Hebrew names are sentences. Every name in these genealogies means something. and the meanings are usually gentle. Seth, appointed. Noah, rest. But Methuselah is built from two harder words. The first, muth, is the Hebrew word for death. The second comes from a root, shalach, that means to send or to bring. Put them together and the name reads, by the interpretation that ancient readers and a long line of scholars since have found impossible to unsee, his death shall bring it. When he dies, it will be sent. Now, honesty first, as always on this channel. Hebrew is a compressed language. The name admits more than one reading, and there are careful scholars who render it differently. Man of the dart, man of the javelin, and I will not pretend the debate does not exist. But hold the ancient reading up against everything you are about to see, the timing of the Father's transformation, the prophecy the New Testament says this Father carried, and above all the almost impossible mathematics of when this child finally died, and you will understand why. For 20 centuries, readers have looked at this name and felt the floor move. Because if the old reading is right, then in the year 687 of the world, God told Enoch what was coming, and told him the timetable, and the timetable was his own newborn son. The boy was the deadline. As long as the child breathed, the world was safe. The day the child died, the water would come. His death shall bring it. Enoch looked into the crib and saw the countdown of the entire first world sleeping in a blanket. And the text says that from that day, for 300 years, he walked with God. Of course he did. What else do you do when heaven has made your family the doomsday clock? And heaven was not finished with Enoch because the lost books say the hidden years ended with a summons. The Book of Jasher records that an angel of the Lord called to Enoch out of heaven and told him to leave his solitude, to go out among the sons of men and teach them the ways they had abandoned. The hermit was being sent back in, and Enoch went, and the effect he had on the drowning world is one of the most remarkable stories in all the lost books, and one of the least known. He taught, and men listened. Word spread of a man in whom the wisdom of heaven actually lived, and the sons of men gathered to him. First dozens, then multitudes, and then Jasher says the rulers came. Kings and princes, 130 of them by the old count, came from across the settled world to hear the walking man. And when they had heard him, they did something that no other age of the world would ever do to a preacher. They crowned him. They assembled together, the text says, and made Enoch king over them, and the seventh from Adam reigned over the whole race of men. Think about what that means for a moment, and how completely it breaks the pattern of every story you know. The first world, the world of the Watchers and the Giants and the murder ballads, at the very bottom of its corruption, was ruled for a time by the single most righteous human being who ever lived. And his reign, Jasher says, lasted 243 years, and it worked. He judged the sons of men in justice, the text records, and the earth had peace, and men turned back to God during all the days that Enoch ruled them. 2.5 centuries of peace, in the middle of the age of monsters, held in place by one man. It is the great forgotten golden age of the antediluvian world, the calm eye in the 16th century storm, and almost no one alive today has ever heard of it. But a man who walks with God, the texts say, belongs less and less to the world of men. And Jasher records the strangest detail of Enoch's reign, a detail that reads like nothing else in ancient literature. As the years passed, Enoch began to ration himself. The presence of God so filled him that the company of men became a garment he could barely keep on, and so he withdrew by degrees, and a schedule was established. For a season, the king appeared before the people one day in 3, then one day in 7, then one day in a month, and at the last, one day in a year, a single annual audience. And Jasher says the kings and the multitudes waited for that one day with a longing they could not explain, and that when he finally came out to them, his face, the text records, had begun to frighten them, because the brightness of it was no longer entirely the brightness of a man. The world was watching its greatest king become translucent. He was fading toward heaven in plain sight, at a rate you could mark on a calendar, and everyone knew, without being told, that the day was coming when the schedule would simply run out. But before it ran out, the first world had an older appointment to keep, because in the year 930, while Enoch still reigned, the sentence spoken in Eden finally collected its original defendant. Adam died. Read the words in Genesis slowly, because the whole chapter has been building its drumbeat toward them. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. The first man, the one who had named the animals when they could still answer, who remembered the taste of the garden's fruit and the sound of God's footsteps in the evening, who had carried the memory of paradise through 9 centuries of exile, cities, idols, murders, and monsters, closed his eyes, and the last living witness of Eden left the earth. And the Book of Jubilees, recording his death, pauses to make a point of the number, because 930 is 70 years short of 1,000. And the text says Adam lacked 70 years of 1,000 years, for 1,000 years are as one day in the testimony of heaven. And therefore, Jubilees says, the old sentence, "In the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt die," was kept to the letter. By heaven's own clock, where a millennium is a single day, Adam ate in the morning and died before the day was out. The sentence took 930 years to arrive, and it was never late. The old books record that the whole earth mourned him. Every family of man at the grave of the one ancestor every family shared. And the traditions say, Enoch himself, the reigning king, led the burial of the first man, the 7th from Adam, laying the first from Adam in the ground. And here I want to hand you 2 facts side by side, because together they will change the way you feel about everything that comes later in this story. Adam died in the year 930. Methuselah, born in 687, was 243 years old when it happened, which means the boy whose name was the deadline spent nearly 2.5 centuries in a world that still contained Adam. Methuselah could sit with the first man and hear the garden described by the only mouth that had ever eaten from it. And now run the clock forward, because Methuselah, as you will see, lives all the way to the very year of the flood. Do you see what that does? It means the people of the flood generation, the mockers, the crowds who would one day stand laughing at the ark, lived alongside a man who had talked with a man who had walked with God in Eden. From paradise to apocalypse, across 16.5 centuries, the entire history of the first world could be crossed in 2 handshakes. Nobody in the old world was more than one living witness away from Eden. They did not drown for lack of information. Remember that. 57 years after Adam went into the ground, the world lost its king, and the manner of his going is the most spectacular exit in all of ancient literature. The year was 987. Enoch was 365 years old, 1 year of life for every day of the solar year, as if his very biography had been keeping heaven's calendar. And Genesis spends its shortest and strangest obituary on him. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was not. No death notice, no grave, the one man in the whole tolling chapter about whom the bell does not ring. But the Book of Jasher tells the long version, and the long version is astonishing. Enoch, it says, was told from heaven that his time had come, and he gathered the kings and the multitudes and rode out among them, teaching as he went, pouring out everything he had in a final circuit of the world of men. And as he rode, the text records, a horse came down out of the sky. A horse descending from heaven, and the horse paced in the air, waiting. And Enoch mounted it and rode on, and the crowds followed, and he turned and told them plainly, "Go back to your tents, for the place I am going you cannot come," and most obeyed. But some would not. A remnant of kings and men refused to leave him, and for 6 days he rode, and they walked after him, and on each of those days he stopped and begged them again, "Turn back," and on each day a few more peeled away, and a few did not. And on the 7th day the text says, "It came to pass that Enoch ascended into heaven, in a whirlwind with horses of fire and chariots of fire. The sky opened over the procession, and the storm of fire came down, and the king of the whole earth went up into it alive, and was gone. And the men who had refused to turn back were never seen alive again." When the king sent searchers to the place of the ascension, Jasher records, they found the ground covered with snow in a land where snow did not fall, and beneath the snow the bodies of the men who had stayed. Whatever came down to collect Enoch, the mere edge of it, the hem of that whirlwind, was more than flesh could stand. Heaven took one man up alive that day, and the cold of the door killed everyone standing too close to it. The first world buried its father in the earth, and lost its king to the sky within a single lifetime. One man down into the dust, one man up into the fire, the two directions a human life can leave this world, demonstrated back to back, and after the snow melted, mankind was alone with its clock, and the clock kept ticking. Seth died in the year 1042, and with him the last man who had known Adam as a father. The great witnesses were thinning out, generation by generation, and with each funeral, the world's memory of the beginning grew fainter, and its behavior, the old books say, grew worse. The peace of Enoch's reign rotted away within a generation of his ascension. The idols came back out, the Watcher's arts, which had never been unlearned, ran wild in a world with no king worth fearing, and the violence of the giants filled the earth. The stage was setting itself for the ending. And into this darkening world, in the year 1056, a child was born, and his birth is one of the strangest scenes in the entire Enochic library, and I am going to tell it to you exactly as the closing chapters of the Book of Enoch tell it, because almost no one on earth knows this story exists. The father was Lamech, not the killer with the two wives and the sword song, that Lamech belonged to Cain's line, and the reuse of the name across the two families has confused readers for millennia. This Lamech was of the line of Seth, the son of Methuselah, the grandson of Enoch himself. And the Book of Enoch says that when Lamech's wife bore him a son, the child that came into the world stopped his father's heart with fear. The baby's body, the text says, was white as snow and red as a blooming rose. And the hair of his head was white like wool, and his eyes were beautiful. And when he opened his eyes, he lighted up the whole house like the sun, a newborn glowing in the birth room. And the infant stood up in the hands of the midwife, and opened his mouth and blessed the Lord of heaven, an hour old, and already praising. And Lamech looked at this shining, speaking newborn, and was afraid. And the fear that seized him tells you everything about the world he lived in. Because Lamech's first thought was, "This child is not mine. This is one of theirs." He ran to his father Methuselah and said, "I have begotten a strange son. He is not like a man. He resembles the sons of the God of heaven. And it seems to me that he is not sprung from me, but from the angels." Sit with that for a moment. The corruption of the Watchers had gone so deep, the fear of what might be growing in any womb had become so ordinary, that a righteous man in the holiest family on earth could look at his own firstborn and suspect heaven's fallen sons had been in his house. That is what the age of the Nephilim did to the world. It poisoned the cradle itself. But Methuselah knew where answers lived. His own father was Enoch, and Enoch, though taken, was not gone. The text says his dwelling was with the angels at the ends of the earth. And Methuselah went to him. The old man traveled to the borders of the world and called out for his father, and Enoch came and heard the story of the shining child. And what he answered is the hinge on which this entire history turns. "The child is yours," he told Methuselah. "The boy is truly Lamech's son, and he is righteous and blameless. And the glow is not the mark of the Watchers, it is the mark of heaven's favor." And then Enoch, the man who had stood in the throne room of fire, unsealed what he knew. "A great destruction is coming," he said. "The Lord will bring a deluge upon the earth, and all that is on it will be destroyed, because of the corruption the angels wrought. But this child will be saved. He and his household will be the remnant, and from him the world will begin again." And therefore Enoch said, "Call his name Noah, for he shall comfort the earth after all the destruction." And Methuselah came back from the ends of the earth, carrying his grandson's name and his grandson's destiny in the same sentence. Do you see the pattern now? The family habit, 3 generations deep? Enoch was given a son and told to name him for the deadline. His death shall bring it. Lamech was given a son and named him for the aftermath. The same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. That is Genesis' own record of the prophecy Lamech spoke over the boy. One family, holding both ends of the apocalypse in its 2 youngest names, Methuselah the countdown, Noah the survivor, the clock and the comfort. Heaven had written the entire ending into a single household's birth certificates, and then it let the world run. And mark one more piece of arithmetic as the boy grows, because it is quiet and it is devastating. Noah was born in the year 1056. Adam died in 930. Noah is the first patriarch in the whole chosen line, the first in 10 generations, born into a world where Adam was only a story. Every ancestor before him, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, every single one had breathed the same air as the first man, had been able, at least for some stretch of their lives, to walk to Adam's tent and ask. Noah never could. He was born 126 years too late, into the first generation of orphans, the first age of the world that knew Eden only secondhand. The man chosen to carry humanity across the water was the first man in his family who had never touched the beginning. He would have to take it all on trust. Perhaps that was the point. The world Noah grew up in was finishing itself off. The 6th chapter of Genesis describes the final state of the first civilization in language of total systemic failure. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Read the qualifiers. Every imagination, only evil, continually. The text is describing a species whose inner life has collapsed into a single note. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, and all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. All flesh. The Book of Jasher fills in the details of what that looked like on the ground, and they are ugly. The judges and rulers, it says, took men's wives by force. The sons of men in those days took of the cattle of the earth and the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, and taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other, kind blended with kind in defiance of the order of creation itself, as if the biology of the watcher's crime had become a fashion, and the text says the whole earth was filled with blood and with wrong. And then Genesis records the verse that may be the most staggering sentence in the Old Testament, the verse where the narrative suddenly cuts away from the earth and shows you for one moment the interior life of God. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. It grieved him at his heart. Whatever else you take from this history, take that. The flood, in the text's own telling, does not come out of rage. It comes out of grief. The Maker looking at the thing he made, the thing he had walked with in a garden in the cool of the day, and feeling the one emotion the old world never imagined it could cause in heaven: sorrow. And out of that sorrow came a decision, and with the decision, one final act of patience, and it is dated. My spirit shall not always strive with man, the Lord says in the 3rd verse of the 6th chapter, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. 120 years. The old traditions, and the Book of Jasher with them, read that number exactly as it sounds, a grace period, a stay of execution, announced in advance. Around the year 1536 of the world, heaven published the deadline. The flood was now on the calendar, and the calendar was public. Jasher says it outright: the Lord granted them a period of 120 years, saying, if they will return, then will God repent of the evil, so as not to destroy the earth. 120 years to turn, 120 years of the door standing open, and mankind took the 120 years and spent them exactly the way it had spent the 16 centuries before. And the countdown that had been hidden inside a family's names was now written across the sky, and still nobody looked up, except one man. And the Lord said to him the sentence that divides the history of the world in two: but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was, the text says, a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God, the same phrase, the exact same phrase, it was used of his great-grandfather Enoch, the only two men in the whole first world to earn it. The Book of Jasher records his household. He took a wife, and her name was Naamah, and the sons came late. Noah was 500 years old when Shem and Ham and Japheth were born, in the final century and a half of the world, as if the family itself had been scheduled so that the boys would be grown men, married men, exactly when the ship needed hands. And then the command came, and Genesis records it in the driest possible engineering prose, which somehow makes it more frightening, not less. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. Run the numbers into modern measure, and the ancient barge is roughly 450 feet long, 75 wide, 45 high, 3 decks, 1 window, 1 door. Not a boat, a building, a floating warehouse the length of a city block, with no sail, no rudder, no helm, because it was never meant to go anywhere. It had exactly one job: do not sink. And behold, the Lord said, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life, from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee will I establish my covenant. There it is, the first covenant in the Bible spoken over lumber, and the specifications for the passenger manifest. 2 of every sort of living thing, male and female, and of every clean beast by 7s, and food of all sorts to be gathered and stored. And Noah, the text says, in one of the great understatements of all literature, did, according to all that God commanded him. So did he. So the building began, in dry country far from any sea, and the first world was given its last and strangest sermon, a wooden one, rising plank by plank, year after year, visible for miles. The Apostle Peter would later write that the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a-preparing, and he calls Noah a preacher of righteousness, which means the old man did not build in silence. He built and he preached, and the traditions say the world came out to watch and to laugh. Jasher describes the sons of men gathering around the strange growing hole, mocking the gray-headed builder and his talk of water in a land with no water, and you already know why their laughter was so easy. This was the civilization that had watched the river Gihon drown 1/3 of the earth in the days of Enoch, and gone back to its idols before the mud dried. A flood was not unimaginable to these people. It was simply survivable, they thought, ignorable, somebody else's story. And so for years, the decades of grace ran down, and the great hole blackened with pitch under the sun, and the door, the single door, hung open on its side, wide enough for elephants, and the world walked past it laughing, day after day, year after year, all the way down to the floor of the 120 years. And now the whole board is set, and you can see every piece. The ark stands finished in the dry country, provisioned and pitched, its door open. Noah is 600 years old, his sons grown, their wives gathered, 8 souls counted and ready. The grace period is burned down to its final days. Heaven's grief is hardened into a date. And one thing, one single thing, is still holding the sky shut. On a hillside of the old world, in the house of his fathers, an ancient man is still breathing, 969 years old, the oldest human being who has ever lived or ever will. The boy whose father looked into his crib and heard the verdict, Methuselah. His death shall bring it. The whole first world, every soul in it, every mocker at the ark, and every giant in the hills, is living now on nothing but the heartbeat of one old man, and not one of them knows it. And in the year 1656, in the 2nd month, the heart that had carried the deadline for nearly a millennium finally quietly stopped. What heaven did in the 7 days that followed, who those 7 days were for, what came walking out of the wilderness toward the ark in pairs while the world stood watching, and what it sounded like when the fountains of the great deep were broken up, that is the ending of the first world. It is the ending this entire history has been counting down to, and it is next. The old books do not describe the morning Methuselah died. They did not need to. The genealogy had already written the scene into its arithmetic centuries in advance, and now, at the end of everything, is the moment to finally show you the numbers, because the numbers are the proof, and you can check every one of them yourself in the 5th chapter of Genesis tonight, with nothing but the text and your own fingers. Follow the count. Methuselah was 187 years old when he fathered Lamech. Lamech was 182 years old when he fathered Noah. Add them, and Methuselah was 369 years old on the day his grandson Noah was born. Now, the flood came, Genesis says, in the 600th year of Noah's life. Add 600 to 369, 969. And how long, according to the same chapter, did Methuselah live? And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. The text never says out loud that the oldest man in history died in the year of the flood. It does something better. It hands you the numbers and lets you do the addition yourself, and when you do, the sum lands on the year 1656, the flood year, exactly, to the year, like a key sliding into a lock that was cut for it 1,000 years earlier. The name said, "His death shall bring it." The arithmetic says, and it did. The longest human life ever lived was not a record, it was a restraint. Every one of those 969 years was a year the rain did not fall, a year the door stayed open, and the old tradition saw it plainly and said so. The longest lifespan in the Bible belongs to the man whose death triggered the flood, because heaven, having tied the deadline to a heartbeat, then stretched that heartbeat further than any heartbeat has ever been stretched, as if mercy were playing for time inside its own judgment. The world got 9.5 centuries of extra grace, and it never knew, because the grace was disguised as an old man. And his father's other prophecy was keeping schedule too, quietly in the background. Lamech, Noah's father, the man who had named his glowing son the Comfort, died, Genesis records, at the age of 777, in the year 1651 of the world, 5 years before the flood. Do you see what the chronology is doing in its final page? It is clearing the stage. The two last righteous men of the old order, the father and the grandfather of the survivor, are removed in the final 5 years, one just ahead of the other, so that when the water comes, not one soul who deserves rescue will be left outside the boat. Lamech goes first, at the number of perfected mercy, and then only Methuselah remains, the last thread, 969 years old, the entire weight of a condemned civilization hanging from one ancient pulse. And in the second month of the year 1656, the thread was cut. Not by violence, not by giants or floodwater. The texts and the traditions agree that Methuselah simply died full of years, the last natural death of the old world, an old man closing his eyes in the ordinary way, with no idea, perhaps, that the sky had been waiting for permission and had just received it. And then heaven did the thing I promised you at the very beginning of this history, the thing that closes this story like a key turning in a lock. It did nothing. For 7 days, nothing. Listen to the text of the 7th chapter of Genesis, because the pause is right there in the verses, and almost every reader slides over it. The Lord speaks to Noah, the ark is finished, the command to board is given, and then God says, "For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth." And a few verses later, the narrator confirms it. And it came to pass, after 7 days, that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. 7 days. A full week between the boarding call and the first drop. A week in which the ark stood loaded in the dry country, and the sky stayed shut, and the world went about its business, and heaven held its breath. Why? The text does not say, but the ancient rabbis, reading the death of Methuselah against the calendar of the flood, gave an answer that has never been surpassed. And it is one of the most beautiful and terrible ideas in all of the old traditions. The 7 days, they said, were the days of mourning for Methuselah. Shiva, the sacred week of grief that Jewish tradition keeps for the dead to this day observed, in this one case by God himself. The last righteous man of the doomed world had died, and before heaven would destroy that world, heaven stopped and sat and mourned him 7 days, the full measure, while the loaded ark waited and the clouds assembled somewhere beyond the horizon. The final week of the first world was a funeral, not mankind mourning. Mankind, the traditions say, was laughing at the boat. Heaven mourning. The judge of all the earth, keeping Shiva for one old man, and perhaps through him for everything, for the garden, for the walks and the cool of the day, for the species that had been made by hand and had come to this. The delay was never indecision. It was grief, observing its own law. And when the 7th day of mourning ended, the waiting ended with it. But before the water, the world was given one last sign, and this one walked. In those final days, the Book of Jasher records, and the 7th chapter of Genesis confirms in its own spare way, the animals came, not driven, not herded. Noah did not spend the last week of the old world running down antelope with a net. The creatures of the earth, the text says, came to him out of the forests and the hills and the deep wild country, converging on the ark from every direction in pairs, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. And they went in, the text marvels, unto Noah into the ark as if summoned by something no human ear could hear. And Jasher adds a detail so strange and so perfect that once you hear it, you will never forget it. The multitudes of animals that gathered were greater than the ark could hold, and so there was a selection, and the criterion of the selection was this. The Lord brought it about, the text says, that every beast and bird and creeping thing that came and crouched down before Noah, that knelt, was taken into the ark, and every one that stood was left. The animals were sorted by submission. The creatures of the first world, the world that had refused to bow to anything for 16 centuries, filed past a 600-year-old man, and the ones that lowered themselves lived, and the ones that would not, did not. The last week of the old world was a parable performing itself in front of the whole human race, lions kneeling in the dust before a carpenter, and the sons of men stood in the crowd and watched the entire animal kingdom grasp something they still refused to see. Sevens of the clean beasts, pairs of the unclean, the birds of the heavens by sevens, up the ramp and into the dark of the 3 decks, with the food stored and the stalls prepared, and then the family, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons, 8 souls, counted twice by the text as if heaven were checking the manifest. And notice, before they go in, the exact word of the invitation, because ancient readers treasured it. God does not say to Noah, "Go into the ark." He says, "Come. Come thou and all thy house into the ark." Come is a word you can only speak from inside. Whatever was about to happen to the world outside that hull, the voice that called the 8 was already in the boat. And then the date. I told you at the beginning of this history to hold a date for me, and you have carried it 1600 years, and here at the very end of the world is where I take it back. The 7th chapter of Genesis stamps the catastrophe with the precision of a court record. In the 600th year of Noah's life, the text says, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The 2nd month, the 17th day. Now go back all the way back to the garden, to the little Genesis, to the calendar of Jubilees, and the note it made at the beginning of everything. At the close of the 7 years, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, the serpent came and approached the woman. Do you see it now? The same date. The wound and the washing share an anniversary. By the reckoning of the old books, the flood began on the very day of the year that the fall began, 16 centuries later to the calendar day, as if the whole age of the first world were a single infection running its course between 2 17ths of the 2nd month, the day the poison entered, and the day the wound was finally cleaned. Whoever kept these calendars, and whoever wove these texts together across the centuries, they were telling you something enormous in the quietest possible way. Nothing in this history was drift, nothing was accident. The first world did not stumble into its ending. It kept an appointment that was written into its calendar on the day it fell. And heaven, which had mourned for 7 days and waited for 1600 years, was never once late and never once early. The clock you have been listening to through this entire history did not merely count years, it counted days. And on the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the year 1656, it struck. The 8 went in, and then comes a single half verse, 7 words in the English of the old translation, and I would put it against any sentence in world literature for sheer quiet terror. And the Lord shut him in. Noah did not close the door. Read it again. The door of the ark, the one door set in the side, the door the whole world had walked past laughing for years, was closed, at the end, from the outside, by God. No human hand pulled it to. The same hands that had made coats of skins for 2 exiles at the gate of Eden now sealed 8 people into a wooden world, and the sound of that door closing was the sound of the first world sentence taking effect. Because a door shut by heaven divides everything, finally, into an inside and an outside, and there was no third place to stand. Inside, 8 souls and the kneeling animals, in the dark and the smell of pitch and hay, listening. Outside, everyone else. And the traditions say the outside was about to find its voice, because when the fountains broke and the rain began, the laughter died mid-breath, and the Book of Jasher records what replaced it. and the most harrowing passage anywhere in the lost books. The sons of men came to the ark, first hundreds, then thousands, and Jasher puts a number on the final crowd that stops the heart. About 700,000 men and women gathered around the black hull in the falling rain, the same multitude that had mocked the builder for a generation, now pressing against the timber and screaming to be let in. And they called to Noah, saying, "Open to us that we may come to thee in the ark, and wherefore shall we die?" And Noah answered them, through the wood, with a question that had 120 years of grief packed inside it. "Have ye not all rebelled against the Lord and said that he does not exist? And now you come and say, Let us live. Where were you all those years while the door stood open?" The text says the people did not repent even then, they raged. And when begging failed, the crowd of 700,000 did the last thing the old world would ever do. They attacked. They surged forward to break the door, to take by violence the mercy they had laughed at. And what stopped them was not lightning and was not angels. Jasher says the Lord caused the beasts of the earth, the animals that had not knelt, the ones left outside, to surround the ark. And the beasts overpowered the mob and drove them back from the door, killing many, so that in the final minutes of the first world, the creatures mankind had corrupted and mingled and abused for 16 centuries stood in a ring around God's boat in the rain and defended it from the human race. The animals guarded the ark from man. That is the last image the old books give us of the world before the water took it, and I do not know of a darker mirror in all of ancient literature. And the rain kept coming, and the deep kept rising, and the crowds scattered to the hills, and the ark, the text says, went upon the face of the waters and the ring of beasts, and the 700,000, and the hills they climbed, all of it, one by one, went under. Understand what the mechanism of this flood actually was, because the text is very deliberate and most readers miss it. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, two sources, not one. The rain from above, 40 days and 40 nights of it, but first, before the rain is even mentioned, the deep. The fountains of the great deep broken up, the waters beneath the world, the primeval ocean that the creation account says was divided and bounded on the second day, released from below, the seams of the planet opening, the sea rising out of the ground itself. This was not weather, this was creation running in reverse. On the second day of the world, God had divided the waters above from the waters below and hung a world between them, and now on the 17th day of the second month, the division was repealed, and the waters above and the waters below came looking for each other with the world in between. The old boundaries, the ones the earth had been given at the beginning, do not pass, were lifted, and the deep remembered everything. And the waters prevailed, the text says, and increased greatly, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. 15 cubits over the mountains. The text wants you to know there was margin. This was not a close call, not a high water mark on the peaks. The summits of the old world lay more than 20 feet down, and the surface of the planet was a single gray, rain-hammered sea from horizon to horizon, with one wooden speck on it, riding blind, no rudder, no sail, no helm, held by nothing but the intention of God. And down beneath the ark, as it drifted, lay everything this history has walked you through. Think of it now, one last time, the whole inventory of the first world, 16 centuries of it, going dark under the water. The city of Enoch, the first city, Cain's fortress against his own curse, its walls that were built to outlast a divine sentence, drowned. The forges of Tubal-Cain, cold at last, the first furnaces of the human race, filling with silt. The harps of Jubal's guild, the instruments that had carried the first melodies ever made, floating for a while probably, before they came apart. The idols of the days of Enoch, brass and iron, wood and stone, every man's god, standing at the bottom of the sea in the ruined shrines of a species that had chosen them over the voice it once heard in a garden and could not be saved by them now. The fields where Abel died and where Cain died, the hillside where a whirlwind of fire had once taken a king into the sky, and the snow-marked ground where the men who followed him too far had fallen, the tents, the herds, the towers, the bones of giants, and somewhere in the drowned earth, the grave of Adam himself, the dust that had been the first man returning to dust a second and final time, under the weight of an ocean, every footprint, every hearth, every song and grave and threshold of the world before, erased in 40 days, and the text pronounces the epitaph of the entire age in one long, tolling sentence. And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. Noah only remained. The clock that started in a garden had finished its count. 1,656 years, measured out in birthdays and funerals, in warnings ignored and names unheeded, from the 17th day of the second month, and now the whole first world was a single father, 3 sons, 4 daughters-in-law, and a cargo of kneeling animals, adrift on the grave of everything. And the waters prevailed upon the earth. The text says 150 days, 5 months of gray water and no land, the longest silence in the Bible, and then, at the bottom of the silence, 4 words that begin the world you and I are living in right now. And God remembered Noah, not that God had forgotten. The old commentators are quick to say, remembering, in the language of Scripture, is the moment. Mercy moves from intention to act. And God remembered Noah and every living thing that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged, the fountains were stopped, the windows of heaven were closed, and the sea that had swallowed a civilization began, mile by mile, to stand down. And I will give you one last date, one final turn of the calendar, that this history has taught you to read, and then I will let the old world rest. The ark, Genesis says, came to rest in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat, the 17th day, again. Wounded on a 17th, drowned on a 17th, and now, saved on a 17th, the keel of the ark grinding onto stone on the same day of the month that had twice already changed the world, as if the calendar itself were rhyming, as if the God of this story signed his work in dates. The door that heaven had shut, heaven would in time open, onto a washed and empty earth, and the first thing the old man did on the new world soil was build an altar, and the smoke went up from the mountains of Ararat into a sky that had emptied itself of judgment. And the Lord smelled the offering, the text says, and said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, and then spoke over the wet earth the promise that has held every morning of your life in place. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Every sunrise you have ever seen is that sentence, still being kept. So am the 1,656 years. And before you go, stand back with me and look at the whole span of it one last time, because the size of this story is part of its meaning. 16.5 centuries. To feel how long that truly is, run it against our own history. Count back 1,656 years from this morning, and you land in the late Roman Empire, before the fall of Rome, before Islam existed, before England existed, before a single cathedral in Europe had been imagined. Everything from the last Roman legions to the phone in your hand, that is how much time the first world was given. That many generations, that many warnings. A drowned third of the earth in the days of Enoch that they rebuilt on without blinking. A king who ruled them in peace for 2.5 centuries and went up alive into the sky in front of witnesses. A preacher who built his sermon out of gopher wood in their town square for decades. A deadline announced 120 years in advance. And a quiet old man on a hillside, whose every heartbeat, had they known it, was the only thing holding back the sea. The first world was not short of evidence. It was short of the kneeling that the animals managed and the men would not. And the texts preserved all of it, the dates, the names, the arithmetic, the checksum hidden in a genealogy, so that every generation after the flood could run the numbers themselves and understand that heaven counts, that nothing is drift, that mercy is longer than anyone deserves, and judgment is never one day late. The chapters everyone skips were the black box of a drowned civilization, waiting thousands of years for someone to sit down and actually read the instruments. You have now read them. From the first morning in the garden to the keel on Ararat, the complete history of the world before Noah, told as the old books tell it. And if this history has left you with the feeling that these ancient texts know far more than anyone ever taught you, then you should know that the strangest chapter of the first world story has its own full documentary on this channel. The 200 angels who came down on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, the oath they swore, the giants they fathered, and the verdict that explains where demons actually come from. The complete story of the Watchers is waiting for you right now, and it is the missing chapter of everything you just heard. And the next door we open together belongs to the book that gave this history its calendar, the text the early church called the Little Genesis, the book that claims an angel of the presence dictated the true history of the world to Moses on Sinai, week by week, and jubilee by jubilee, the Book of Jubilees. Its story is next. The lost books are a long hallway, and we have only begun to walk it.